Good afternoon. I'm Violet Zariello, Marketing Manager at American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for being here. Past Forward, Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual series where we discuss the enduring themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward conversation explores the little known yet harmful chemicals in the food, clothes, and other goods that Americans buy and use every day. It is inspired in part by our latest film, Poisoned Ground, The Tragedy at Love Canal, which is now streaming on our website, our YouTube channel, and the PBS app. Poisoned Ground tells the dramatic and inspiring story of ordinary women who fought against overwhelming odds for the health and safety of their families. In the late 1970s, residents of Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, discovered that their homes, schools, and playgrounds were built on top of a former chemical waste dump. Housewives activated to create a grassroots movement that galvanized the landmark Superfund bill. In today's conversation, our guests will examine how American consumer culture, combined with uneven industry regulation, works to expose the public to chemical hazards. They will also explore how wealth can determine one's level of exposure while analyzing the government's approach to consumer protection over time. They will look forward by asking what actions consumers can take to protect themselves. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the chat box, and we'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Carlisle Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the GBH Planet Future Fund, members of the Better Angels Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it is my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Dr. Jennifer Thomson is an associate professor of history at Bucknell University. Her current book project examines the effect of the Environmental Protection Agency's sewer grant construction program on racial residential segregation. Her first book, The Wild and the Toxic: American Environmentalism and the Politics of Health, explored the various discourses of health that environmentalists deployed in the late 20th century. Dr. Bhavna Shamasunder is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy at Occidental College. She teaches and conducts research at the intersection of environmental health and justice, with a focus on inequalities and chemical exposures faced by low-income communities and communities of color who live and work in urban and industrial environments. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Tim Bartley. Tim teaches in the Department of Sociology and the Earth Commons Institute at Georgetown University. His work focuses on sustainability standards, environmental justice movements, and the regulation of global industries. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Violet. Welcome to Jennifer and Bhavna. I'm honored to be here with you today to talk about toxic chemicals in our homes and communities. As Violet mentioned, the discussion is inspired in part by American Experience's new streaming film, Poisoned Ground: The Tragedy at Love Canal. Let's get started. Bhavna, I'd like to start off by getting a clearer sense of the kinds of chemicals we're talking about. What are some examples of dangerous chemicals in consumer goods? What kinds of products are we talking about, and how hazardous can they be to our health?
So thank you for facilitating this conversation. So the film focused on the toxic soup of chemicals that are dumped into hazardous waste landfills. So this is not a single chemical, but multiple chemicals that mix together when they're dumped together. So they included extremely toxic chemicals such as dioxin, that is a byproduct of industrial production, which can be toxic in very small doses and causes cancer, birth defects, and reproductive problems. It included polychlorinated biphenyls, which are carcinogenic chemical compounds, and it's actually the only class of compounds that have ever been banned in the US. It was used for electrical wiring covers. pesticides. There was exposures to benzene and toluene, which are volatile compounds, and they've been linked with reproductive harm. But there are 80,000 chemicals that are in production today, industrial production. So there's a lot of chemicals in consumer products.
Good, and maybe we can come back to some of these as well. Jennifer, I think most of us probably assume that many potentially dangerous chemicals in products, as well as the ways that companies deal with toxic substances, are really heavily and stringently regulated. What kinds of regulations are most relevant in these domains? And what do you know? What can we say about how effective they've been at addressing different types of hazards?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. Thanks for asking that. And I'll be kind of blunt. Like that's just not true, right? I think many of us hope that our country's regulatory system functions on what we might think of as the precautionary principle, right? The principle that substances should be evaluated for health risks prior to being released onto the market, right? I think that's a reasonable assumption. It's certainly something I would want to believe. But unfortunately, that's just not how things work in this country. And in fact, they work in the opposite way, where things are released onto the market, and it's only once they are shown to be a problem or reported to potentially be a problem that they may fall under our regulatory structure. So I'll make that concrete by just talking about one particular act that's on the books. So our primary law for regulating chemical substances is the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976. Many people refer to it in a short form as TSCA. And what this act does is afford the Environmental Protection Agency the authority to require that companies report what chemicals they've developed, keep records, and also, maintain a database of their testing. And it allows EPA, if necessary, to impose restrictions related to chemical substances and their mixtures. Okay, so it seems like a good regulatory framework. However, in practice, that's the extent of the agency's authority. So the EPA, at the time of the bill's passage in 1976, was a young agency which had no capacity, budgetary or otherwise, to review the safety profiles of the more than 20,000 chemicals that were then on the market. Much less the outcome of their interactions with each other. And at that time, health and safety testing was only actually available for about 200 chemicals, and that was for each of them in isolation from one another. Nearly 50 years later, in the present moment, there's a stunning 70,000 plus chemicals on the EPA's radar. And to add insult to injury, things like food, cosmetics, drugs, and pesticides are entirely excluded from TSCA. So to sum up, our main regulatory agency for substances that we interact with and that enter into the environment, the EPA, is always beginning on the back foot, constantly playing a game of catch up with products released by corporations, as well as their sum total in the environment.
Really glad you mentioned TSCA in particular, and I've been doing a little bit of reading myself on TSCA and how it failed to deal with PFAS. A toxin that's gaining increasing attention in part because it's poisoned water supplies around the country, and maybe one of the current pollutants that are on people's minds as they watch this documentary. So I wanted to ask both of you more about what you see as the relationship between consumer culture in the US and these kinds of chemical exposures, regulatory failures, and health hazards.
So I can start. U.S. Consumer culture is not inevitable, and as Jennifer was saying, that the exposures that we face are really because the burden of proof of kind of showing something is toxic sits on the consumer. You have to get sick. You have to show that something hurt you. And then it can take a mountain of time and data to be able to get any sort of justice, if any at all. So, but our consumer culture was created. It was created by the chemical and petroleum industries with support from the federal government and a lot of subsidies after World War II, and wartime chemical production, which much of manufacturing was turned during the war to fight the war. And after the war ended, the question was, what happens to all of this manufacturing power? and all this chemical stock, and we actually turned much of this production into our domestic economy. And we see after World War II a huge increase in the number of chemicals we use in our everyday life, the number of consumer products that are pushed onto consumers, the growth of the suburbs that really pushed people to buy, fridges, and all the things we see as conveniences today. And plastic items in particular, really these disposable items were really created after the war. And we're struggling now to get that under control. And household items, electronics, plastics, much of these are this product of the petroleum and chemical industries that sell us products. Often we don't need them, and they're not disposed of properly. They're manufactured in ways that are not sustainable, and the cost is to our environment and our health. And so this consumer culture is not one we have to live with, but it is one that has been supported by many decades of sort of government support and corporate efforts to keep it that way.
And I'm glad you put that in sort of historical perspective, that we're living in still the remnants of a post-war economic boom that was fueled by not only all sorts of toxic substances, but fossil fuels that are it's increasingly clear has left us in a very, very difficult place. Jennifer, as the historian, do you want to add any more to thinking about how American consumer culture has contributed?
I mean, honestly, I think Bhavna's answer was great, right? Like, this consumer culture that we live in today oftentimes gets looked at as the reason why we deal with all sorts of, health issues, exposures, et cetera. But that all ignores the fact that this was all, a very deliberate creation of excess production by chemical and petroleum companies in the World War II era.
It seems to me that the part of the reason that TSCA, the regulation you mentioned earlier, is somewhat weak is that it was designed to not slow down the introduction of new products and to allow the market to grow and grow, as opposed to taking a more precautionary approach, as you mentioned earlier, and actually as governments in Europe have been a bit more interested in doing, requiring that data and testing be done on a more extensive scale before the products are actually put onto the market.
Exactly.
So much for
I think
for
that's a
your
really
insights.
good point. Okay.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I think that's a really important point, because when TSCA passed, 60,000 chemicals were grandfathered in for use. And so the existing chemical infrastructure wasn't overhauled in any way. And as a manufacturer, you would be more inclined to sort of use what you already could use rather than try to create cleaner, greener products.
Really appreciate these insights. And we've started to talk a bit about the kinds of chemicals that manufacturers can put into consumer goods at various times and how they're dangerous to our health. We've also discussed a bit about how government regulation or the deficiencies of government regulation can shape our exposures. Let's watch a clip now from Poisoned Ground, which delves deeper into the kind of business practices that allow toxic chemicals, toxic waste to be released into the environment. So in this clip, we'll see how Hooker Chemical Company sold its toxic waste site at Love Canal to the city of Niagara Falls, New York, and how that land was then turned into a residential community. Let's watch now.
Everybody knew Hooker was a chemical plant. People certainly knew many of the chemicals that they had produced. Nobody knew, however, what they had actually dumped as waste material. And nobody really knew how many drums were buried in Love Canal.
They filled up the entire area with about 100,000 chemical barrels. People at Hooker Chemical weren't thinking in terms of long-term chemical risks. And they thought when they dumped this stuff, even if it broke out of the chemical drums, the landscape itself would just absorb it like a big sponge.
In the 1950s, Niagara Falls was an expanding city. Everything was going great guns economically.
Most of the individuals who bought homes worked at Hooker and other chemical companies in Niagara Falls. And so it was seen as this great neighborhood that had good transportation to their jobs at the chemical plants.
This is a time when people looked at a landscape and didn't worry about what's underneath it. And Love Canal, the covered over chemical dump, is actually viewed in the 1950s as a great developmental opportunity.
In the spring of 1953, Hooker Chemical sold the land to the Board of Education in Niagara Falls for $1. And they got out of the Love Canal business.
The Niagara Falls School Board signs an agreement with Hooker Chemical, which basically says that there is chemical waste buried underneath the Love Canal site, but it doesn't say exactly what type of chemical waste is in the ground. This is where they're going to put the 99th Street School. They're going to work with developers to build out a subdivision which will have new housing stock, playgrounds. People who are in charge of hazardous waste landfilling were not really concerned about what happens next. They don't want to know. They don't need to know because government officials were not pushing them. For people in Niagara Falls, you don't want to scare off the chemical industry. Less knowledge is better for business.
So as the documentary then shows, this was met with a wave of activism that made the Love Canal story famous. And Bhavna, I think people often, and I would include myself in this, often remember the story of Love Canal as a story about mostly white families and the activism of white women in particular. But as the documentary shows, there were also concerns and activism in the predominantly Black community in the Griffin Manor apartments. So beyond this particular story, how are low-income communities and communities of color affected by chemical pollution? And does this differ from the experience of the residents that we saw in Love Canal?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for that question. I think that Griffin Manor is a really important and often forgotten part of this larger story. They were families that were renters and a part of a group that was looking for affordable housing and lived in a really nice affordable housing complex. And unlike the folks who could own their houses and could ask for their investment to be recouped, the question was what happens to renters who live by hazardous waste? And they do start to tell the story, but they leave out some historical policy issues that probably just can't be covered in the span of one documentary. But Black families were really locked out of home ownership and generational wealth creation and denied FHA loans and access to credit after World War II through the practice of redlining. And the Black families that were interviewed for this film were renters. And in the 1980s, the environmental justice movement was galvanized, which is part of the movement that I do a lot of work in now. And this really was in 1986, and it was because the hazardous waste facilities across the United States were mapped. The question is, where are they? And they were in predominantly low-income communities of color. And race is really the strongest indicator of living by hazardous waste. And the environmental justice movement has led to decades of organizing by communities, much like the one we see in the film. But many of these stories, families don't get compensated for their exposures. They're often not listened to. Their homes don't get purchased. And that story plays out in communities over and over again in this country today.
I will say when I teach about environmental justice campaigns, which followed, as you mentioned, starting in the 1980s and continuing, especially in the 1990s, and then I show students some clips from what happened in Love Canal, we end up talking about what might have happened if Black activists had used some of the same tactics that the residents at Love Canal did, such as kind of barricading EPA officials in the home, and how that might have actually generated a quite different response. I want to turn to the historical context a bit too. Jennifer, so it's in the 1920s that Hooker Chemical is burying toxic waste at Love Canal, as we saw in the clip. and in the 1950s that the land was essentially given to the city to build a school. So thinking historically, how did people at those points, think about the environment? And to what extent would those acts have been seen as troubling at those points in time?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, Tim, and I think I'll take a couple different approaches to it. On the one hand, I think it's good to be a little bit cautious, right? It's tough to speak of this country as like a unified consciousness, given, as Bhavna has talked about, that we do and have always lived in a deeply segregated nation. So people's experiences are very different, based on where they live. What is true is that in the 1950s, environmental degradation per se was not a national conversation in the way that it would become by the mid 1960s and definitely had exploded into by the 1970s. So, what Hooker Chemical was up to, right, discharging its waste into the Niagara River, burying them in, very permeable ground and in very shaky conditions. When it became untenable to keep discharging into the waterways, that was just business as usual, right? And there was not a lot of pushback from, local government, state government about actions like that. And in fact, one thing that the film brings up, but obviously doesn't put front and center because of its focus, is the fact that Hooker Chemical and the U.S. military were burying things in conjunction with each other all around Niagara Falls. Okay, so this was something that many different groups participated in. I think that being said, in many different local contexts, communities were extremely aware that the places that they lived and worked in were becoming increasingly unhealthy and uninhabitable. Right, so I'll give our viewers just a couple of examples. So factory workers, miners, farm workers, all of these work communities knew that the kinds of chemicals they were being exposed to at work or the pesticides they were applying to fields were hurting their health. And there were already many decades of activism in the workplace around, we would now term environmental health, okay, but which was thought of as occupational health at that time. And certainly many communities in the 1950s had started to organize around the effects of nuclear fallout from above ground weapons testing. So there were ways in which, people were starting to become aware of the interrelationship between what was in the environment, whether that be where they lived, where they worked, et cetera, and their own health and the health of their communities. And that, of course, was the groundwork for what we now understand to be an environmental consciousness that would, kind of come to be per se in the 1960s.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, it's easy to look back and think that people just weren't paying attention to this, but it's really important to see that some were paying attention to these kinds of hazards, even at earlier points, and their voices just weren't amplified enough to make a difference in most cases. So let's talk a little bit about change. We've kind of hinted a bit at changes in our consciousness of environmental hazards and environmental health. We've talked a bit about the ways in which corporate negligence, weak government regulation, and indifference, I think, from the city government in Niagara Falls contributed to this phenomenon, this disaster at Love Canal. To what extent are things dramatically different today? Can you speak to the experiences of communities in the U.S. that are still struggling with impacts of toxic chemical waste in the current period, and what kinds of contexts and challenges they face?
So I would argue that the situation has remained largely the same, and in some cases has worsened because corporations have become even smarter about getting around any sort of government or regulatory oversight. And, we have disasters, industrial disasters, all the time, all over the country. In Los Angeles, which is where I live, the Exide disaster is a well-known one. It's the biggest industrial disaster the state of California has ever seen. It was a lead acid recycling facility that was given a temporary permit for decades, and it left a perimeter of lead exposure that is very expensive to clean up. The community still lives with in a lead poison neighborhood. And the industry itself, Exide, they were allowed to sever their assets from their liabilities, not pay for the cleanup when they had said they would. They actually escaped white collar crime because they said they'd pay to clean it up, but then they declared bankruptcy and walked. And so I think bankruptcy laws really allow corporations to argue that they are not liable for cleanup. And I think bankruptcy reform is really important if we want to see environmental justice, because I think we've seen many companies do this, even when they're held liable in court, like Johnson & Johnson was held liable for selling baby powder with asbestos. And when they were held in civil court liable for payments, they just severed their assets from their liabilities and declared bankruptcy, which we know Johnson & Johnson is not bankrupt, and didn't pay. So I think that those efforts of the government needs to close those loopholes and really think about structural inequities, and that the burden of scientific evidence of trying to show that these industries are harming us is really sitting on the community's shoulders. And it persists. And maybe Love Canal was a big success story of the community galvanizing and building data and demonstrating that communities can have knowledge, and they do have knowledge, but that's a huge burden to kind of hold for decades. And we really do need to shift that structural flaw that we have and make companies show that they're safe before they can operate, regulate them, make sure that they're cleaning up and not violating their permits, etc.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the point about how companies can sometimes escape liability even when the burden of proof and the evidence is there. And of course, communities all around the country have mobilized to collect evidence and to build cases, and sometimes have been quite successful in doing so, even if the results have often been disappointing. Jennifer, what do you see in terms of changes to this arena over the past several decades?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm on the same page here with Bhavna. Like in many ways, things have gotten worse. So this may be hard to kind of like wrap our heads around, but if we're thinking about the Love Canal situation, like that happened, all of the revelations and the fighting with the state and the federal government, that all happened at sort of the peak strength of the American environmental regulatory state, right? So the 1970s is really when we have like a more robust architecture of regulatory legislation passed, right? We have the Clean Air Act, we have the Clean Water Act, we have various amendments that go along with both of those. We have Toxic Substances Control Act, and then the decade ends with the passage of what is, commonly known as the Superfund Act, right? So there's all of these kinds of like major laws passed, which, however, flawed they may be, they certainly were better than what had existed before. Okay. The EPA was also created in 1970, but throughout that decade, and then, beginning with even greater force in the 1980s, the laws and the regulatory infrastructure were gutted, and they have not been able to recover. So, if we think about it, like the Love Canal community, as tragic as that situation was, like that tragedy happened amidst at least more robust regulatory state, and that's something that we just don't have in the present moment anymore.
Just to be a little bit slightly different, I want to see what you think about the actual pollutants, though, because it seems to me that something like dioxins that were discovered at Love Canal, am I right I'm not sure if we're in the right position to evaluate this claim or not, but my impression is that those are far less common, and there are different hazards that communities are facing today. But some of the specific hazards that were documented at Love Canal actually were cleaned up because of the Superfund program.
I don't know if you want to take this one, Bhavna. I can say a little bit about the Superfund program, but yeah. I'm happy to defer.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so, Superfund gets passed in 1980. And this was the first federal attempt to, of course, begin to clean up these kinds of dumping grounds that existed all around the country. So Superfund imposed a tax on the chemical and petroleum industries, which was to be put in a trust fund for cleaning up any of these abandoned or uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. But to get to your point, Tim, to date, 1,900 locations have been designated as Superfund, and only 25% have been fully or partially remediated, right? And we can even ask questions about whether remediation is in fact what we might want to think of as a cleanup. And of course, it's a fair assessment to say that there are a lot of either unreported or undiscovered sites, or sites which don't meet EPA's criteria for designation as Superfund, but are still deeply polluted sites.
Good, I appreciate that. Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about how corporate actions, government interaction, and sort of public awareness or gaps in public awareness can raise the risk of chemical exposures. But when these exposures are uncovered, what does the response tend to be? To think about that question, let's watch another clip from Poisoned Ground, where we see how Hooker Chemical's PR machine tried to turn the Love Canal crisis into a broader conversation about the public's relationship to chemicals in modern life. Let's watch now.
Hooker officials, when they testify before Congress, say, look, you all should know that we produce really toxic stuff. But we also produce miracles in American life. Everything that American industry and consumer life is based on depends on chemicals. And sometimes we have to recognize that chemicals are made from hazardous material.
His electric light bulb contains argon, a gas that keeps it burning. His shower curtain is decorative waterproof plastic. His suit contains chemical fibers that keep it looking better longer. His car is made stronger.
It's oftentimes argued that we have to expect some negative effects from the conveniences of modern life.
Protected with all winter antifreeze.
We all bear some burden for the presence of toxic substances in our environment.
Better things for better living through chemistry.
But I would argue that only some people have choices about what gets produced. Only some people have choices about what gets regulated. And for the most part, the remainder of society, and in particular its poorest members, are oftentimes the guinea pigs for these substances.
Summer of 1979 is a real tipping point for the Love Canal crisis. In the last year, there have been 2 state health declarations and 1 federal emergency declaration. But the majority of families are still living in Love Canal. And with remediation and the summer dust and the summer heat, the smells are worse than ever.
We still have people very sick, some of them hospitalized, and contaminated homes.
The residents reported that it was hard to even go outside. And Lois Gibbs used this as leverage. She argued that people couldn't live like this. And ultimately, state officials agreed to a short-term fix. Governor Carey still remained opposed to any more evacuations. But anyone still trapped inside their homes, both homeowners and the residents of Griffin Manor, were given the opportunity to stay in local hotels.
And you need accommodations for your families. Okay?
And suddenly, across Niagara Falls, people were living almost like refugees in their own city.
One of the things that we see in this clip is Hooker Chemicals kind of make this claim that their products are an inescapable part of consumer life, and that maybe environmental and health hazards are just another inescapable part of our modern consumer conveniences. Bhavna, do you think we should just accept that trade-off, expect that our modern conveniences inevitably have negative health or environmental impacts?
I mean, I think that we should accept that there are some things that we may use that may be very convenient while you're using it, but that you pay for with your health and the environment. I think you mentioned PFAS earlier, and right, this is a really durable substance that didn't break down in the environment, used in lots and lots of manufacturing. Things like nonstick pans, waterproof materials, like they mentioned. And you want your food not to stick to their pan. And but then every time that chips off of your pan, you might throw it away. But that stuff is really persistent in the environment, and now it's in all of our water supply, and it exposes our health. And so it's not inevitable if we really think about sort of a circular economy, that the things we make come from somewhere and they have to go somewhere. So plastics are another really good example. We really have loved our plastic conveniences, but making and disposing of these are toxic. And we have a lot, and it's ending up in the ocean and destroying our oceans around the world. And so it's really not and I don't think that most people actually would want this situation. Like, if given the knowledge of the trade-offs, people try to do better. And so we really need to be able to facilitate improved consumer efforts. And I think this is recognizing this kind of closed economy that, corporations need to deal with, kind of a cradle to cradle approach, a cradle to grave approach. They need to address the chemicals that, products they create. They have to be disposable. And in some ways, I think by accepting that the externality of the convenience is the cost to our health and the environment, is one that the government has made. In some ways, they've accepted it, that, companies don't have to kind of look at the entire life cycle of their product. And I think that shift needs to be made. And as you said, Europe does some of this a lot better than we do.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you connect this to what happens after we dispose of our products. I think some of the damage gets done in the manufacturing and the waste that's produced there. And then some gets produced by what happens after the consumer uses the product. And definitely both elements need to be part of the conversation. So, Jennifer, you have this part in the clip that we watched, a really striking part, I thought, where you say that some people get to decide what's regulated, and others serve as kind of guinea pigs for substances that aren't regulated. Can you expand on that a bit in today's context? And what does that say about how we're being left vulnerable, or some are being left vulnerable to chemical hazards, and who's making those kinds of decisions about who faces and doesn't face those kinds of hazards?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think the important point here is, like, to a certain extent, everybody is being treated as a guinea pig, right? Like, we can think, and again, we've come back to PFAS in this conversation multiple times, and I think for good reason, right? We can think about the ubiquity of PFAS in our water supply as a great example of this, right? Like, no matter who you are going to be exposed to PFAS, right? You're going to have some level of it in your body at this point. However, communities of color and the poor are presumed to be guinea pigs. And I think that's the big difference here, is that, while everybody is exposed to things, there are certain communities who are treated presumptively as guinea pigs in this country. I mean, examples of this abound all over the place. We could certainly think about the way in which, toxic birth control pills were tested on Puerto Rican women in the 1960s. Avna, you talked earlier about how hazardous waste sites, hazardous industrial sites are disproportionately located in poor and minority communities, right? So we can think about the history of zoning in this country and the way it exposes people to things, or something that we know happens quite frequently, right? The illegal nighttime dumping of toxic substances in minoritized communities. So there's all of these ways in which our society reflexively treats certain communities as guinea pigs and also profits off of that. And to a large degree, the responsibility for this behavior lies firmly on the shoulders of corporations and elected officials. But it's also a reflection of historical decisions for whom many people some without as much power bear responsibility, right? So, the history of local zoning codes, which associate race with geography and confine particularly African Americans to neighborhoods zoned for industrial uses.
I'll say, as the person here that studies global industries, global supply chains, I think your statement about guinea pigs also applies there, where lots of hazardous materials that are really not used in manufacturing within the U.S. are used in manufacturing products that are sold within the U.S. Because those laws are not the same at the point of production. So this, I think, leads to the question that we were discussing just before the panel started, that may be important and also difficult question to really answer, which is about the links or the tensions between environmental justice and consumer protection. That is, can attempts to promote environmental justice go hand in hand with consumer protection policy? And can the two reinforce each other, or are there kind of real contradictions between these two ways of viewing environmental hazards?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that I would say both, right? So they go in hand and they sit in real tension with each other, because I think that, and one of the areas that I spend a lot of time working in is in personal care products. So this is anything that you go into your pharmacy or big box store and you see this huge array of personal care products, 18 deodorants, 35 lotions, right? It's really hard to discern what's going to be good for you, what might have an endocrine disrupting chemical in it, what you might want to avoid. It's very difficult for the average consumer to do the work that it takes to think about the ingredients on that back label. I mean, we tell people, yes, the shorter the list, the better it is. The shorter the number of products you apply to your body every day, the safer you are. But these are unregulated products, and so all consumers are affected by this. But we see some of the more toxic products being sold in communities of color. And so, and also some of the cheapest products being sold to the poor. So, and the cheapest products can be more toxic. So if you're looking for better products, they often can be more expensive. And so that is not in reach for everyone to swap out things that might have hazardous chemicals in them for things that are safer. And we see that sort of in by the kinds of stores you go to, where you could shop online. Everyone knows that, some products that are labeled to be more healthy tend to be more expensive. And so that is a disproportionate burden on people who can afford things. And consumer protection does tend to focus on this idea that you can shop your way to safety, and that you could buy better products somehow. But in the chemical economy that we have discussed, how does that work? And can you fully protect yourself? And so that you may be able to some extent, for certain, by avoiding some things, but then you can't avoid other things that are in manufactured products, or if you live by a facility, for example, it's very hard to avoid. And so I think just focusing on the consumer alone erases some things that we need to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, the big question that we probably don't have time to really solve is whether this idea of shopping your way to safety has actually led us not to regulate environmental and safety hazards very well, that our presumption that this is something to be solved by consumers sort of shopping wisely and paying attention to their purchases, and those that have the power to do this in the marketplace exercising that power, may actually be one of the reasons why our regulatory apparatus is not as strong as it could be.
That's right. And I think the idea that self-regulation, corporate self-regulation, has also played a role here, that companies argue that they can regulate themselves and that they can do a better job of it than the government does. And so that, I think, has also led to some of this.
So on that note, let me turn to a couple of questions from the audience that have been sent in here. One exactly on this question of regulation. And the question is this: is there any legislation in the works that would imitate Europe's standards, I think meaning the more precautionary approach to environmental hazards? And if not, are there things we can push for from our elected officials in this regard? Jennifer or Bhavna, someone want to take a stab at this?
There has been many, many efforts at overhauling our chemicals economy. And so I think oftentimes legislation gets introduced at the federal level to do an overhaul of TSCA, and it almost always gets defeated. And so we haven't actually been successful at shifting federal chemicals regulation. A little bit here and there. There have been some working on the edge. But so what's happened is that states is where, individual states have actually made a lot more progress in passing statewide legislation than at the federal level. So there's lots of examples of this in things like regulating certain chemicals in beauty products, banning kind of the most toxic chemicals in nail polish. But this tends to be sort of a list of chemicals that are presented for regulation or some products that then need to be reformulated. But there hasn't been a comprehensive federal approach.
Jennifer, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think my argument would be very similar to what Bhavna just said, is that, it's really on the state and local level that there's been any movement, and that, there's any possibility of, getting these kinds of regulations enacted. But again, the regulations, such as they've been put into place, are still reflecting this very kind of like catch-up approach of like people figuring out that something is toxic and then pushing to get it taken off the market or regulated more stringently. What we really need is a reworking of our economy to actually put the health of people and the environment first, right, rather than as a last concern.
Thank you. I appreciate both of those comments, and I do think that reforming the TSCA is there are some efforts, right? And I think there actually were, just before the Trump administration, there was an amendment that tried to deal with some of the problems that you both mentioned earlier. And I have to say, I'm not quite sure what has become of that. I take it from your comments, you don't see that as a dramatic change of course, but maybe a small move that could be expanded in the future. So another question from the audience here is about the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and I don't know how much we can delve into the details here, but the question was whether the FDA has a list of chemicals that are hazardous and whether that is public information or not, or how the FDA deals with these kinds of questions.
There are some, so I don't know comprehensively to answer that sort of with a comprehensive view, but I can say from, we test pharmaceuticals before we sell them, but consumer products are not tested before they're marketed. There are the most toxic things. So I work a lot on skin lightening products. So mercury is regulated as an ingredient in skin lightening products at a level, a very low level. It can only be in a product at a very low level, but the enforcement is really lacking. So you can go online and go, and buy products with much higher levels than are allowed to be sold. So while they're on the books as not being able to sell or make something that's a very high level of mercury, you can still purchase it. And I think some of this is because of the way the internet's regulated or not, and also the lack of enforcement that the FDA doesn't actually go checking.
Yeah, and I think, to add to that, obviously, there's tens of thousands of additives in the food supply, right? And these are, again, largely unregulated, right? Sometimes one of them will rise to public concern enough. People will communicate with the the FDA, organize sufficiently, and the FDA will begin to regulate. But again, the FDA's enforcement capacity is pretty limited. So we're all existing amongst these substances until one rises to the level of being, a severe public health concern.
So I think one of the other questions from the audience has asked us to kind of compare the severity of hazards from chemicals and products we use compared to toxic waste dumping or maybe other kinds of hazards that are in the air and water and ground around us. Do you have thoughts on how we should think about like the hazards from what we consume versus the hazards that are in the environment around us?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I mean, as someone who works a lot in communities that are struggling with industrial pollution, I would say that, living nearby industrial pollution, manufacturing exposures, hazardous waste dumping, like those are really severe, cumulative, synergistic, multiple burdens that then often are piling up on top of other types of stressors like poverty or linguistic isolation or racism, that they all kind of operate together. And I think sort of the hazards of manufacturing are singular and should be considered as such. A lot of the consumer products, the things that we're really worried about are things called endocrine disrupting chemicals, and those are regulated, are not regulated actually, and are toxic at pretty low, very low levels of exposure. And they burden your endocrine system and then shift, have developmental reproductive impacts that have pretty long horizons. So you might not see the effect right away. And they are, they affect very kind of vulnerable windows of development. So pregnant women, growing fetuses, people in puberty, right? Like when you're in these very rapid developmental phases, if you're exposed to the endocrine disruptors, you can have effects, developmental or reproductive effects. And so those are the things we've often worried about in consumer products, phthalates, parabens. When you see the paraben-free or phthalate-free, that's what we're worrying about. And that's why they've come out of products in the manufacturer. We haven't regulated them, but the industry has taken it out, knowing that there's a consumer worry about them.
Now, could you just give a couple of examples of the kinds of products you're talking about?
Yeah, so if you see lotions are a good example, or you'll see bisphenol A kind of in water bottles, you'll see BPA free. There are, a lot of these consumer products have phthalates and parabens in them. So deodorants, you'll see paraben free or phthalate free on them. So it's actually a big range of personal care products that have some of these chemicals. They are coming out though. We do see that they're coming out more and more. The concern is that we don't know what's replacing them. So it might be labeled paraben free, but we're not actually sure what the replacement is. And in chemical policy, that's called a regrettable substitution. If you take something out, but we don't know what's going in, and then it takes decades of research to figure out what was a replacement, and then whether or not that's a problem. So I think if we are substituting things that we know are problematic, to get ahead of them and replace them with something that we know is safe.
This touches on another question that came from the audience, which is about parents and thinking about their children's safety. What would you recommend to parents thinking about how to protect their children and adolescents, particularly from kind of cheap personal care products?
Yeah, again, and I think, Bucknell, I'll mostly defer to you on this question since you're the expert. I think, the advice is complicated, right? Because it comes down to, once again, like the individual or the family unit is being presumed to be the ones who have to be responsible for all of these things. And the extent to which you can actually, afford to shop in what may be a more clean fashion is dependent on your income, right? Which is, inherently a hierarchical thing. So I'm not really sure if I can give great advice on, how parents can protect their kids apart from, avoiding exactly what, Bhavna's been talking about here, to whatever extent it's possible for you to do that.
Yeah, and I would think that knowing that it's really hard, it's a hard conversation, and it is a burden. It's like an unfair burden that's been placed on families to figure out what's safe for their child, and not knowing. I mean, I will say that there are fragrance products. I have a teenage daughter, and we are often grappling with the things that show up in our bathroom that I didn't purchase. So I think that I think fragrances are one area that I feel quite concerned about. If it says fragrance on a label, that's protected by trade secrets. They don't have to disclose. So that one word could mean 100 ingredients that are in that one word. So I think that things that are fragranced are I've thought about, avoiding more of, but also reducing your overall use of products, a number of products that you use every day. You could, kind of make it the minimum amount. It's really hard to avoid everything. So also becoming sort of so frozen by the worry around it is also not a sustainable way of being.
This is, in theory, the reason that we have regulations is because we might all want greater safety, but it's really hard as an individual consumer and even a well-informed consumer to really follow through on those principles. And so it seems like the other piece of advice here is don't assume that it's necessarily up to the consumer to solve this, and keep demanding that governments at state and national levels take the health effects of these kinds of products really seriously, and demand greater evidence of safety before the products can be put on the market. So on that note, I think one person from the audience has asked kind of what to do now. That is, what resources and organizations you would suggest for someone who wants to learn more, or to be part of a solution here, or a different approach to toxics in the U.S.
You want to start?
I can start. Get our answer going. I mean, I think there's any number of grassroots organizations that are doing really interesting work, both grassroots organizing work, but also policy level work that you might want to connect with. My approach would always be to, start at the local level. So I would really take some time to research, who's active in your area, whether that's, your specific town, or, more regional, your area of the state, and just see like what organizations are out there, what struggles are they engaged with, and how can you, start to support their efforts.
I mean, I agree that starting local is a really good idea. And this is like from your regulatory agencies, find out kind of what are your local regulatory agencies, water, air district, how do they, when they make decisions, they're required to have public comment, see what kinds of decisions are being made kind of around industry, around production in your neighborhood, and showing up for public comment and learning about what's nearby, and advocating for safer processes, and just keeping an eye out. That is a hard thing to do when you're working full time and you have a family, but it's also really effective in a lot of ways. And joining the movements, it's a public health movement, environmental health and justice movements, organizations on the ground doing this work. There's lots of them that are working for chemical policy reform, that are working to make sure that communities of color are informed, that environmental justice principles are sort of being a part of the larger environmental conversation. So I'm happy to kind of send information if people want to reach out to me, but I think local organizations are doing really great work.
And I think one of the points that comes through in this conversation, as well as in the documentary, is that a lot of important decisions and damaging decisions can happen at local and state levels. We often think about environmental problems as these sort of big international issues, but the actions of city governments in the case of Niagara Falls, and the actions of state regulatory agencies can actually make a big difference in environmental health and environmental justice kinds of issues. Thank you both so much. It's been really nice to talk with you about this, and the conversation could go on, and I hope that it will in some fashion. But thanks so much for being part of this panel, and thank you to the organizers for inviting all of us into this arena.
Thank you
And
to you
thanks,
both.
thanks to all of you for joining. Of course, you're welcome.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation. Poisoned Ground, The Tragedy at Love Canal is now available to stream in full on our website, our YouTube channel, and on the PBS app. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great evening.